The period of the past several decades that had been marked by American dominance in the region, America's big military footprint in wars such as in Afghanistan and Iraq, that era is coming to an end, or really has come to an end. We are seeing instead several things. One, that the US attention is divided, looking at places like Ukraine, like China, also a sense of fatigue with the Middle East and a desire, frankly, to pull away from the Middle East. And I think third, from the region itself, a sense that America is not reliable.
Welcome, everybody. Among other disagreements concerning the region, there is no full agreement on what the Middle East actually is. Surely it is vast, stretching all the way from the Atlantic to the Arabian Sea, and surely features a multitude of dynamics and conflicts, including and exceeding the Israeli-Palestine matter that understandably preoccupies many of us, many Americans. And although that war, or though that war may seem unending, we also know that this region is experiencing a lot of profound change. So how shall we begin to understand what is happening and what America's Middle East policy is or should be? And I am so glad that we are all here tonight with a real expert to help lead us through these intensely complicated matters. So welcome to tonight's Great Decisions program on American foreign policy in the Middle East, featuring Mona Yacoubian. I'm Mary Eintema, President and CEO of WorldBoston, and it's wonderful to see you tonight here for the first time in the Nonprofit Center. People have understandably big feelings on this topic, on this region. This is not a community forum. However, we will be here for networking for 30 minutes after the program. Stay for more conversation, please, until 7:30. Following the program, for those, as I said, we'll have some refreshments, and we'll be selling the briefing book on Great Decisions, which I highly recommend. It's really well done. All right, now, at last, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mona Yacoubian. She's a senior advisor and director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm abbreviating, but wow, she's the right person for us tonight. She has more than 30 years of experience working on the Middle East and North Africa with a focus on conflict analysis, governance, and stabilization challenges, and conflict prevention. Her pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and various other outlets. And she has testified in Congress 6 times. I also want to shout out the fact that I am so honored I get to serve on the board of the World Affairs Councils of America with the national board with Mona. And we have a spectacular conference coming up in DC in November that is indeed open to the public. So you can go back and tell the rest of the board that I shouted that out. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Mona Yacoubian.
All right, good evening. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you to WorldBoston. Mary, thank you for your kind introduction. And Harrison, thank you for all your effort to get me here. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening to talk about the Middle East and American foreign policy. What I want to do is start with sort of a roadmap of what I'd like to go over with you to speak about this evening. I think that's helpful. So I'll start with my 3 key bottom lines. Those will be the things that if you remember anything from tonight, it's those 3 things that I hope you'll take away with you. Talk a little bit about the war this past June between Iran and Israel. Then I'm going to dive a little bit into the regional flashpoints that have emanated from the conflict in Gaza, and then conclude with some thoughts on U.S. foreign policy and where things might be going. So it's a full agenda. So let's start with our 3 key bottom lines up front. And in a lot of ways, what I hope this will do is help you as you pick up the paper or go online and read about all the different events that are happening in the Middle East, help make sense of them, help create a frame, a systematic frame for understanding them. So The three key bottom lines that I like to think about up front are, first and foremost, that the Middle East is at a hinge moment. And by that, I mean the order that has pertained for several decades is in the process of vanishing, and a new, as yet to be fully defined order is emerging. For me, this is a foundational framework for understanding pretty much everything I'm going to talk about tonight. Second key bottom line, and I'll be referring to these throughout the night, is that the 12-day war that took place between Israel and Iran this past June is also a reminder that we're not only at a hinge moment, we're also at a crossroads in the region. A crossroads between moving onto a path toward de-escalation, stability, even prosperity on the one hand. The other path leads to a deepening of conflict, chaos, and potential reverberations that have global implications. And the third key bottom line is that the conflict emanating from Gaza in many ways serves as a crucible from which this order will emerge. So let me talk a little bit more about what I mean when I talk about a hinge moment in the region. There are several things I think that fill into this idea of a hinge moment. The first is that the period of the past several decades that had been marked by American dominance in the region, America's big military footprint in wars such as in Afghanistan and Iraq, that era is coming to an end, or really has come to an end. We are seeing instead several things. One, that the US attention is divided, looking at places like Ukraine, like China, also a sense of fatigue with the Middle East and a desire, frankly, to pull away from the Middle East. And I think third, from the region itself, a sense that America is not reliable and that the United States is in fact pivoting away from the region. The second key element of this hinge moment is that regional actors have far greater agency to shape this emerging multipolar order. And I think we can see in particular in this emerging Middle East that the Gulf serves as the new center of gravity. And in the Gulf, I would argue they have three key priorities. The first is de-escalating tensions, is bringing the region's conflicts to a close. The second, and it relates directly to the first, is because they feel an existential imperative to diversify their economies. And the third is that they are planning for what will soon be a post-oil Middle East by developing new energy alternatives, renewables, and so forth. There's another key, very powerful actor in the region, and that's Israel. By far the most powerful military in the region. And here too, Israel is also seeking to shape the contours of this new Middle East. So 2 days after October 7, 2023, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a point of saying that Israel seeks to reshape the face of the Middle East. And I think we're seeing a lot of that as in the many military interventions that we've seen. I should note that that idea comes directly from what happened on October 7th. I'll be talking about it in a moment, but essentially one of the most significant terrorist attacks in Israel, 1,200 people killed, the largest number of Jews killed in a single day since the Holocaust. And so that has brought about a new doctrine in Israel of never again. And that's what's provoking a lot of the military interventions that we are seeing. The key question, though, is going to be for Israel, do those military interventions actually translate into a new strategy, into sustainable strategic gains? And I think that is very much an open question. And that relates to the third point of this emerging order, which is that there is a battle on to shape the new Middle East. There is a battle, and I think we saw it most dramatically last week when Israel, targeting Hamas operatives in Doha, Qatar, unleashed unprecedented strikes on the Qatari capital. Now, what's interesting about that episode is that those Hamas operatives were reportedly reviewing a new ceasefire proposal. And they're in Qatar, of course, because Qatar is playing a very important mediating role. The Israelis, again, with this idea of never again, there had been a terrorist attack just the day before. We will strike Hamas anywhere, anytime, unleashes these strikes. And so you see a dramatic clashing of these two approaches, military intervention, efforts at mediation. I think in many ways, this is what's going to determine the region's trajectory. Which way does it go? So the other way to think about the region are these key flashpoints that have emanated from the conflict from the Hamas terrorist attack, as I said, killing 1,200 Israelis, more than 250 seized as hostages. There are still some 20 hostages still alive in Gaza today. But then we also saw very quickly the ensuing conflict in Gaza, which has exacted an enormous toll. More than 65,000 people killed, both civilians and fighters. And there are lots of questions about those estimates as to whether the numbers may actually be quite higher. In addition, there's the humanitarian catastrophe that has unfolded in Gaza, to include even a declaration of famine in parts of Gaza, massive starvation, widespread destruction. And I think no less significant, and something that is often not reflected upon, are the invisible wounds that both societies are enduring right now, both Israelis and Palestinians, the trauma that is associated with this horrific conflict. From Gaza, we have seen reverberations across the region, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and the Red Sea. And so I will touch on each of those. I'm mindful of time. I'll give you top lines, and any of these things that you're interested in, we can talk about in the Q&A. Okay, so let's talk about the chronology of the 12-day war, which took place this past June between Israel and Iran. And this is a momentous, I think, development in the region. The way this conflict goes, in many ways, so goes the region. That's why it's important, I think, to focus on it. So on June 13th, Israel undertook preemptive strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, military leadership, nuclear scientists. It was declared as a preemptive strike that Iran had essentially failed to comply with its non-proliferation requirements. Over the next 12 days, we saw Israel and Iran engage in a very significant conflict that included exchanges of missiles and drone strikes. This is the most significant conflict between these two powers. And of course, on June 22nd, the United States entered the fray. President Trump approved strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear sites, including the underground facility at Fordow, using US bunker buster bombs. On June 23rd, Iran retaliated against the United States in what many believe, and I certainly believe, was a highly telegraphed and choreographed strike against the US airbase in Qatar, the El Udeid airbase. It was, I think, done intentionally not to cause casualties, to find an off-ramp. And indeed, Qatar then, right the day after or hours later, negotiated a ceasefire between the US and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other. And that shaky ceasefire still holds today. You can see from this map the many, many strikes that were undertaken. Some 20 Iranian senior military commanders were killed. Israel estimates that it destroyed some 80% of Iranian air defenses. The key question, the question I think that really will in many ways determine the trajectory of the region, is will this ceasefire hold? And here I think there are several factors that we have to consider. One, it's not entirely clear exactly how much damage was done to the nuclear program. There are big questions still floating around about for how long has Iran's nuclear program been disabled. It's certainly been set back, but not clear for how long. The second key question, what happened to the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that Iran has? Where is it? Buried under the rubble, or was it secreted out to some other location? In response to this current situation that we're in, the E3, 3 European countries, Germany, France, and the UK, undertook what are called snapback sanctions. These are UN sanctions that have been imposed on Iran for its non-compliance. Those were undertaken in late August. However, there are 30 days between when those sanctions are triggered and when they actually come into effect. We are in that 30-day window right now. And there is a diplomatic off-ramp that will help de-escalate this conflict, that if these various measures are taken, could actually lead toward diplomacy. As of this point, only one certain condition has perhaps been met, and that is Iran once again resuming cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. We still don't know the whereabouts of the uranium, and nor has the US and Iran actually resumed discussions. So at this point, we are, I think, in a very fragile moment that could go either way. If in fact the sanctions are triggered, Iran, or come into effect, Iran has vowed that it will withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then we're back into a very dangerous, I think, moment where Israel could say, we have no idea what Iran is doing, we're concerned that they're restarting their nuclear program, and resume military strikes. So there are the questions of what will Israel tolerate? What is considered too much for them in terms of a concern about uncertainty regarding Iran's nuclear ambitions? And there's also the question of Iran's intentions. What does Iran do? There are many who believe that Iran's key takeaway from what happened, from these strikes that were undertaken, by the way, while they were in the midst of negotiations with the United States, indirect negotiations, Iran may come to the conclusion that its best option, its best deterrent, is to actually obtain a crude nuclear device. And so there is a concern that Iran could sprint toward a crude nuclear device. These are the questions, I think, that are going to pertain in the coming days. Let me turn now to the other key defining conflict of the region, which is, of course, that conflict in Gaza. And here, unfortunately, prospects for a ceasefire are dimmer than they've ever been. With the strikes last week and Doha's temporary suspension, or perhaps permanent suspension, of its mediating role, and also with the incursion into Gaza City beginning today on the ground by Israel, this really, I think, makes only a very distant prospect the possibility of a ceasefire in Gaza. And it raises really bigger questions about what Israel's endgame is, especially without any real plan for a so-called day after. For how will this territory be governed? How will security be provided? And I think raises an even bigger question about the possibility of whether Israel is in fact sowing the seeds for its own forever war in Gaza by having to essentially occupy that territory. One of the other key flashpoints coming out of Gaza is in Lebanon. This is a bright spot. So if you're looking for some positive news, pay attention now, because this is one of the few right now in the region. On October 8, one day after Hamas's terrorist attack, Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite militia, initiated strikes against Israel. There was a tit-for-tat escalation that eventually led to a very significant escalation by Israel, leading to essentially the decimation of Hezbollah, the assassination of its leader, the assassination and the killing of many of its senior ranks, the degradation of its military arsenal, etc. This is a significant change in the Middle East. It has dramatically altered the region's power balance. It is the decimation of Hezbollah that led to then the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it's also the decimation of Hezbollah that has opened an enormous opportunity for Lebanon, for the Lebanese government to regain control of its own sovereignty. So we have now in place in Lebanon since January the first president and prime minister who are not beholden to Hezbollah. And more importantly, they have called for this militia to be disarmed, as per the ceasefire that was negotiated between Lebanon and Israel in November of last year. And there is very small, but I think significant progress being made toward Hezbollah's disarmament. At this time, however, Israel continues to occupy 5 border posts along the inside Lebanon. So they're inside Lebanon occupying, and they continue to undertake military strikes, including just yesterday in southern Lebanon. So it's a very fragile situation, but it's one in which one could see the way forward of the Lebanese government moving forward with disarming, of Hezbollah gradually withdrawing from Lebanon, ceasing its military strikes, and opening, frankly, a new era for Lebanon. Okay, Syria. So this is another fascinating development emanating directly from Gaza. As I said, the decimation of Hezbollah paved the way for the collapse of the Assad regime. This is a regime that has been in power for some more than 50 years, and of course was in the throes of a very, very bloody civil conflict. I think there are 3 key drivers that led to the fall of Assad. One is the distraction of its key allies, Hezbollah being decimated, and of course, Russia being distracted by its war in Ukraine. There's the hollowing out of the Assad regime itself by corruption and years of inefficiency. And again, the dramatic weakening of Hezbollah and Iran, of course, as well. But I think with Ahmed al-Sharaa, a former al-Qaeda leader who has disavowed his ties to al-Qaeda and is now in control in Damascus, there are key questions that remain. Can he consolidate control? And if he does, how will he rule Syria? And here the verdict is out, and I would say it's mixed at best, and unfortunately, I think moving in a negative direction. So Ahmed al-Sharaa hails from a group that was at one time affiliated with al-Qaeda. There are still many elements within that group over which he has not the best control. They are not disciplined, and they have undertaken all kinds of attacks and atrocities, in particular against Syria's minority communities. Minority communities on the coast, the Alawites. This is the minority sect that Bashar al-Assad, the former dictator of Syria, hails from. The Druze minority in southern Syria. So this raises big questions about, number one, how much control does he have over these various groups? Number two, how will minorities buy into Syria and buy into this new government if they feel endangered and unprotected? So these are some of the key questions that we have before us. And unfortunately, as I said again, they are moving, I think, in the wrong direction. There are enormous geopolitical reverberations that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, but I would argue that the collapse of the Assad regime essentially has upended the power balance across the Middle East. It is a significant development. The last point I'll make here, and I think this picture is significant, of President Trump with Ahmed al-Sharaa to his right, and of course the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to his left. The United States, or President Trump, during his trip to the Middle East in May, undertook 2 key decisions that many think could help Syria put it on the right path. One was to lift US sanctions on Syria, which have been a significant obstacle to the country's emerging from the economic collapse that it experienced throughout years of war. And the second is normalizing ties with the Syrian government, with Ahmed al-Sharaa, who will be in New York at the end of this month at the UN General Assembly, which is a pretty incredible thing to think about. The first time in 60 years, a Syrian leader will come to the UN. And of course, a leader who at one point was a member of al-Qaeda. Last key flashpoint is with the Houthis, a ragtag militia from Yemen, one that none of us had heard of, but not long after the October 7th attack in November of that year, they started targeting ships in the Red Sea, commercial ships, supposedly in support of Gaza. Some 100 ships have been targeted by them. They then escalated their tactics. They have actually flown ballistic missiles and drones and sought to target Israel directly. That has then provoked an Israeli response. In some ways, this is one of the most unpredictable of the flashpoints. Even today, the Israelis targeted the Yemeni port of El Hudaydah, which is under Houthi control, saying that there were Iranian arms being transferred there. So this is still a very hot element of the many different flashpoints reverberating out of Gaza. So what does all of this mean? Where does the region go? I would go back to that idea of a crossroads. And either way, we are going to see a new order emerge in the Middle East. I think the question is, which one of those paths is the region on? Is it on the path toward a prosperous and stable Middle East? And here I think you would see that we have these shaky ceasefires in that case that are actually holding, that Iran and Israel both opt for diplomacy. We're in that moment right now. Where Syria and Lebanon, these two countries really on the verge of unparalleled opportunity, move towards stabilizing. And where we see a grand bargain in the region, where we see all of these different interconnected elements come together in a much more peaceful and prosperous region. The other path is of a Hobbesian Middle East, a Middle East that is mired in conflict. Here we could see that this current window of opportunity for diplomacy with Iran closes rapidly, and that Iran sprints for a nuclear weapon. We could see Israel, again, resuming its strikes on Iran. We could see Syria and Lebanon neglected and falling more and more in toward conflict rather than stabilization. So those are the two pathways. I think the key question is, where does the region go? And this is where US policy comes into play. So this last slide really talks about the indispensable role that the United States can play in all of this. We are not front and center. We don't have a big footprint, but we still have an indispensable role to play and can make all the difference between a stable Middle East and a Hobbesian Middle East. If you look at think about each of the previous elements in the prior slide, here, if the US demands that there be a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, if the US uses the leverage it has to compel Iran back to the negotiating table and finds a way to negotiate a peaceful off-ramp with Iran with regard to its nuclear program, if the US seizes its role to help catalyze stabilization in both Syria and Lebanon, here I think you can see the United States playing that key role of knitting together these various pieces that would build to a stable and prosperous Middle East. I don't need to go through all of the negatives, but it's very clear what they would yield. If we see the continuation of conflict in Gaza, if we see the ceasefire that currently pertains between Israel and Iran collapsing, if we see Syria descending back into civil conflict because this current ruler is not able to bring together the various minority groups that need to feel included in the new Syria, or if Lebanon, attempting to disarm Hezbollah, moves too quickly, is not able to do it, and we see the provocation of civil unrest in Lebanon. All of these factors could lead to that nightmare scenario of a Hobbesian Middle East. I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions. So thanks, very good questions. No, the bases remain, although there are questions about whether the US will be withdrawing from Syria, very small, and Iraq. But I think what I meant by that was that our mode of intervention has absolutely shifted from big footprint on the ground, hundreds of thousands of troops intervening. And again, I think that's typified by what we saw in Iraq and what we saw in Afghanistan. What I'm really trying to say is the era of US counterterrorism, post 9/11 interventions in the Middle East has really come to an end. That's really the point. In terms of the BRICS, yes, of course the BRICS can play a role. And I think this is what I mean when I say it's a multipolar Middle East, and that we are no longer in an era of US dominance of the region. We are seeing Gulf actors and others hedge and develop ties. In fact, we have the BRICS Plus, which includes Iran, it includes the UAE, Egypt, I believe Saudi Arabia has been invited. And so the answer to your question is absolutely, they will play a role. But they can't play the indispensable role that the US can play if it chooses to exercise its leverage. And here I'm talking specifically about Gaza and Iran. In both of those instances, the US occupies a unique role to help negotiate both of those conflicts toward a peaceful end, should it choose, and it may not. We're seeing some unprecedented signs of the Lebanese state reassert itself. As I said, we now, for the first time in memory, have a president, a prime minister, and a cabinet that is not under the sway of Hezbollah. We have seen that they have sort of eliminated the framing of governance, which was the people, the army, and the resistance, elevating Hezbollah to that level. The resistance. That is no longer the case. And Hezbollah really does not have the veto power it once had. And so we saw in August a momentous decision taken by the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, which is huge. I mean, it's really unprecedented. I think the question before us is how that happens, and can it be done in a way that does not actually provoke civil unrest, given exactly these questions about a Shia community that may feel threatened and disaffected, et cetera. What does that mean, and what does that look like? Just last week, the army submitted a plan for how it intends to disarm Hezbollah. It's going to be done in 5 phases. One phase has a timeline, so in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah is to be disarmed in 1 to 3 months, but after that, we don't know. And so I wish I had a definite answer for your question. The answer is we don't know, but there are some, as a colleague of mine says, it's glass half empty, glass half full, depends how you look at it. The only other comment I'd make is that Israel has a role to play here as well. And as long as Israel continues to occupy 5 border posts in southern Lebanon and continues to undertake strikes at will in southern Lebanon, in the Bekaa, sometimes even in Beirut, that's going to undermine the legitimacy of the current government. And it's also going to give Hezbollah the pretext that it's looking for to retain its arms. But this has to be pursued, I think, delicately, given just how complex the sectarian politics and dynamics are in Lebanon. So I think there's a big question mark here about recognition and so forth. You're absolutely right. And this is one of the key issues, of course, from the perspective of Israel. Right now, the issue is centered around Iran's nuclear program, its nuclear ambitions, its ballistic missiles, and also its behavior in the region via its various proxies. Those are the key issues that have been raised by Israel, by the United States. And the question there is, can all 3 of those issues be addressed diplomatically? I guess I would argue, I don't know, it's not at all clear that regime change in Iran is the answer, because we don't know what would come next, and there's no guarantee that what comes next isn't worse than what there currently is. In fact, by many accounts, we may well see movement more toward a military dictatorship, toward Iran that is really under the throes of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and others, or just utter and complete chaos, which I think would have enormous negative impacts, not just for the region, but for the global economy. So at the end of the day, it's really going to be via diplomacy that this issue of Iran and its nuclear program is resolved. The question is, can the United States and Iran get back to the negotiating table? And can the US effectively use the leverage it has to get the sorts of agreements that are required from Iran in order for sanctions not to be put in place and for conflict to continue? I think that's the key question. Israel has said, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made clear, if Israel believes that Iran is resuming nuclear activity or replenishing its ballistic weapon missiles, that it may well strike again. And then we're really back again, I think, in a very dangerous situation in the region. Thank you. Unfortunately, in conflict or in fragile and conflict-affected areas, women are among the most vulnerable and among the most negatively impacted. That is certainly the case in Gaza, where we've seen that women and children are disproportionately affected by the conflict. In Syria, it's a different kind of problem. In Syria, you have now come to the fore a Sunni Islamist and relatively conservative government in which women's roles are far fewer than had been the case. Even, again, there are many, many issues with the barbaric regime of Bashar al-Assad, but we're seeing now questions about really when and how women could be elevated into positions of real authority. So I unfortunately don't see it in either of those examples. I think the best hope, frankly, for women and for civilians in the region is, again, movement toward de-escalation of tensions and conflict and an opening towards stability that will create the space, ideally, that will allow women to assert the role that they should well be playing. I should say one last thing, though. Women are a critical element to peace negotiations and treaties that are enduring. We know that when women are excluded, those kinds of peace treaties are usually far less durable.
Did you touch on Iran and women at the moment? Women life?
I mean, the question was about Iran and women, and again, here we've seen a very vicious crackdown following the war, the 12-day war. Lots of fear about various penetrations by the Israelis. So the answer is, if anything, no, we're seeing far more repression and fewer freedoms in Iran. Well, I agree. That's why I said I think a ceasefire is further away than it's been. But there are big questions about Israel's military decisions as well. The idea of total eradication, even from the perspective of Israel's military, it is really more fantasy. And by all accounts, this decision that they are currently undertaking to occupy Gaza City was taken over the heads of Israel's senior military leadership. Because net, Israel has accomplished everything that it can militarily. It's raised big questions about diminishing returns for this continuation of the fight, so to speak. And so I think that's why, in a way, that's where negotiations come in. And there will need to be some kind of negotiation. Ultimately, the Palestinians, the Arabs, no one sees a role for Hamas in terms of governance or security. The Arabs themselves have called for disarming of Hamas. So I think all of those questions are on the table. It's how you get there. Thank you. I think the Abraham Accords certainly proved fairly enduring, even after October 7 and the war in Gaza. But that said, there's growing concern amongst Arab and frankly broader Muslim nations with respect to Israel's conduct of its war in Gaza, and now more recently the strikes that took place on Doha. And so there's real concern about what does normalization mean? What does it look like? And I think that there are some who say that the Abraham Accords may even be threatened by the current set of circumstances in the region. Maybe they'll be put in a deep freeze, if not abrogated altogether. It's very hard under the current circumstances to imagine any progress toward normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's just not going to happen. And so I'm afraid that for now, and in the current situation that we're seeing in the region, the Abraham Accords really don't represent much of a way forward unless and until we start to see some real shifts toward de-escalation. So we've already seen rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that's part of this hinge moment that I was describing. Very important transformations that have been taking place in the region. The region, Saudi and the other Gulf countries, increasingly believe that they can integrate Iran into the region. If anything, I think they are concerned by Israel's behavior and view Israel to be more of a threat to stability than Iran. In terms of President Trump's policies and so forth, it's hard to talk about how, we're in it's done in a very different way. It's very personalized. You have the president, you have the Secretary of State, and you have perhaps 2 or 3 other people that have a key role to play: Steve Witkoff, Tom Barrack, maybe Morgan Ortagus. As I said, I think we've seen some interesting openings under President Trump. The question is, are they exploited, or do we see things going the other direction? I can't answer the question because I think it's a very idiosyncratic approach to policy, and I just don't know. I don't have an answer to that question.
I'm going to allow myself a question. I often take one, and that is the stock, as it were, the standing of the U.S. at this time as a partner to do business with, to do diplomacy with, to do all kinds of engagement with. Where are we at in the region?
The U.S. has taken a real hit in the region as a result, in particular, of what's happened in Gaza, and a sense, I think, by the Arab world, and maybe much more broadly by the global South, that the U.S. is not exercising the leverage that it has on Israel, that it's not playing a more forceful role to ensure that more progress be made toward a ceasefire. When I travel to the region, often there are real kind of puzzled questions about why it is that the U.S. is not doing more to sort of stem the violence in Gaza. And so I think that our soft power has taken a big hit in the region right now.
And also our other types of engagement, such as U.S. aid, et cetera, if that's.
Well, of course. I mean, the dismantling of USAID, of course, is another data point that underscores just the ways in which the U.S. is just simply not present in the region in the ways that it has been in the past.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Mona Yacoubian.
Thank you.
So.